stewardship takes work. Like, what is stewardship? Jesus says, I'm giving you things for you to manage. You can't be lazy about it. It's going to require work. You have to produce something good out of it. I'm giving you these gifts. I'm giving you these talents. I'm giving you all this stuff for you to do something with it. It takes work. But I think we don't want to do that work. It's easier to just think, oh, my church told me that we're just going to go this way on all the issues. And that's what we're supposed to do, because that's what Christians do. Welcome back to Jesus versus America. Jesus told us we couldn't serve two masters, but we are always trying to serve Jesus while also following the dictates of the American culture. I'm John, and I'm joined by my good friends Monique and Wisdom, and together we represent three generations that are faithfully trying to follow Jesus. Today we're talking about how should a Christian steward a vote. We're in an election year, and this is going to be one of those years where everything seems to be, especially as we head into election season, all about the vote. But it is an important question. Jesus told us to steward everything in our lives, our talents, our treasure, our time, every breath we breathe, everything that we have is all for the Lord. All of life is for Jesus, including something like a vote. Now, at the time, Jesus and the other apostles and all of the people in the first century didn't have a vote. They didn't live in a democracy that allowed votes for those people. But we do live in a place that does allow us to vote. So how do we steward that vote? So we've got a couple of tips that we're going to discuss that might help shape a little bit of the way that we think, how should we steward a vote? So the first one we're going to start with is that we actually need to be voting instead of rooting. And it does seem that more and more what we do is root for a team rather than actually vote. Anyone want to make the distinction? Like, how would we know if we're voting or rooting? Like, is there a test we could apply to know, like,
sure.
Yeah.
What would it be? If you're going down the ticket and just looking for the R or the D or whatever it is, and you're just all the way down because it doesn't matter to you as long as your political party is the one winning, that's probably a good sign that you're rooting instead of carefully considering policy and votes are so different. It's not just president, not president, whatever. So there could be some really good, ideas in terms of policies on both sides. Yeah. And are you someone who's carefully considering what that would mean to you, to others, to the community, and voting accordingly? Or are you just towing the political line?
Yeah. I think if your social media looks like a campaign ad and doing the marketing for the candidate, and it's the whole person and constantly the stories where the bar is this much and you're tapping through and it's all the quotes and campaign
or it just
images.
Becomes your whole identity.
Yeah, the idea of rooting comes from rooting for a sports team, right? And when you think about it for a moment, you think I'm sad when my team loses, and then maybe a friend of yours comes and says, well, your quarterback or your forward or whatever sport you're playing isn't actually the best in the league, and you're like, yes he is, yes she is, of course they are, and you've got to line up all your views to match a team that you support. That's rooting as opposed to voting. So maybe the litmus test might be, if you see a good idea but it isn't advanced by somebody in the party that you are kind of subscribing to, you might be rooting rather than voting, because I don't think that anybody has a corner on all good ideas. Or if you're disappointed, deeply disappointed when somebody of another party does something good, then you might be rooting
or
rather
those
than voting.
Who disown or disavow, not my president. You know what I mean? You see that, he's not my president or she's not. Yeah, if you've the whole idea of voting is a civic act that you do in support of your country. If you're willing to tear the country apart, secede from the country, or you'd rather see the country broken apart than have the other side win, you're definitely rooting and not voting. If you move for the full, the only stake of being in a community of like-minded people, you're rooting.
If you use the word like-minded, you might be rooting.
You're rooting.
Because I've noticed that is the new kind of dog whistle. Yeah. When someone come up and go, well, we're looking to be around some like-minded people. Oh, as soon as they say that, I think, oh, wow. So do you go to rallies for that? Because that's getting kind of strange.
If you cut off relationships and deep relationships of friendships, family members,
for differing votes or differing political thoughts, you're rooting.
Yeah,
Stay together.
if going to Thanksgiving after the election,
And of course it is.
half the group is so silent they look like somebody died, and the other half has that like grin that just
That
says
glee?
like it's like, then you
You're
know
rooting.
you're rooting,
Rooting.
right? I mean, if you want to watch sports on Thanksgiving, that's good. Do that,
Yeah.
but don't make politics a sport, because you're not voting at that point. All you're doing is reflexively rooting for your own party. And look,
mob mentality.
maybe that's what you think the American experience should be like. That is not what stewarding a vote as a follower of Jesus should be like,
100%.
right? Where you hold something that you go, not every country's been given this right. And not everyone will even exercise this right. But if I'm going to exercise it, I want to do
thoughtful,
it. Yep. I'm going to steward what the Lord has given me for that. So that's one thing. Vote. Don't root, and check yourself, because many of us are actually rooting. No matter what side of the spectrum you're on, you're probably more rooting than voting and actually deciding what to do. So second, educate yourself about the issues, the initiatives, the candidates.
Put work in?
Yeah.
Read? No.
So anyone want to confess that they've actually voted without knowing what they're voting on? Like, because that is an American tradition.
I have.
I wouldn't say that I don't know anything about, but for sure voted on things I didn't look deeply.
Yes.
Like I'll get a general idea sometimes and be like, okay, that's good enough.
Yeah. And I think most of us, like we have a sense of what those things are, but like we live in a state where they actually put things on the ballot that the legislature should be deciding, right? And so special interests and other people who have lots of money, they'll go around the legislature and put stuff on a ballot and then ask us all to vote on something we know nothing about.
Right.
So you walk into the voting booth, or you have your mail-in ballot, and you look and it says like, okay, $6 billion in bonds for pre-K schooling education. And you're like, I like kids. You know nothing about it. How long is it going to take to pay back that $6 billion? Like, who's behind this? Where does this money go? There's that voting guide over there, but I'm out of time. I just got to decide. I go, I like the kiddos, so you just vote yes. Like, hey, sounds like free money for the kids. The next one's like, $9 billion in new highway transportation funds. And you're like, yeah, there's a lot of traffic. Let's vote for that one. And you end up. There is a lot of uneducated voting going on, and I don't think that's really stewarding a vote if you're making decisions
or just
without
saying
knowing.
no because you don't understand it also isn't great, because you're like, I don't really understand that, so I'm just going to say no. Maybe it would have been a great thing, and you didn't abstain from that vote, and you went away without fully understanding.
I'm not going to put you guys on the spot on this, but I used to put all my students in my public policy classes on the spot, and I'd say, who's your senator? I mean, this is a state issue, not even a local one. Who's your senator? You have two of them, by the way, just in case you didn't know. You have two senators. Who are they? And like, I would get these blank stares, and then I go, I'm not going to even ask you about your local Congress representative, right? Because I thought maybe the statewide one, but you guys could just for a moment, in the honesty before God, just stop and think, do I know who the two senators are in our state? This is what I mean about being educated. Like, we're not voting, and you're tempted to root when you go in and go, I'll just vote whoever has the R next to their name or the D next to their name, or I have no idea who these people are. And yet we're talking about representation and civic duty, and we want these people to spend our money wisely. We don't even know who they are. We don't know what they stand for. We don't know what they say. So I don't think that's a really good way to steward something as important as voting if we know nothing about it.
And I think what's important is to do that research with an open mind, which I think is really, really hard.
Yes.
Because you're like, oh yeah, I'm going to learn all about the policies that are coming from my side, and just skimming, the other side, or untrusting. But I think having an open mind and really looking at certain policies, legislations, whatever it is, and saying, oh, maybe that's actually a good idea, even though it didn't come from my side. Or, you know what, I'm not so sure this is a good idea, even though it's coming from what I identify as.
Yeah, it's tragic how much we don't pay attention to what's going on. Like, many of these people running for office, many of the initiatives that are put on ballots, many of the things that we're voting for, they go out of their way to try to educate people about them. That's, they'll go to forums. There's actually small debates. There's people who are nonpartisan who'll like parse the issues and talk about them, right? And most of us just kind of like, we don't see any of that at all. We might join a tribe on social media who's going a certain way, and that's what we decide to do, right? But I don't think we're stewarding the vote well if we do that. So, okay. Third, I think the biggest thing that we fail to recognize is that our vote is the most potent locally. and all of us are obsessed with the
Grassroots.
national race.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep. And I think we know, like, we think, oh, I want this team to win, or I want this person to win the presidency. I want them to sweep the House or sweep the Senate.
Yeah.
But we don't think about the fact that, like, our vote is actually most potent on a very, very hyper local level.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, like when we're voting for somebody for the school board.
Yeah.
Right. Or
Yeah.
when we're voting for somebody for our city council in our city, it's more potent.
Yeah.
Like we live in a state where the state is going one way every election, no matter what. It just won't change.
Yeah.
Right. In fact, most people live in a state that will never change.
Yeah.
Like there's probably like
The rare swing states,
yeah,
but
we should just figure out which the swing states are and save a lot of money and just have them vote, right? Like, like it'll be like a basketball game. We'll just fast forward to 2 minutes left and make the score 81-81 and go. Just play 2 minutes,
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
and that way we don't have to watch
Yeah.
the whole thing just to get to the same outcome
Yeah.
every time, you know, where we got 2 minutes left, we have to decide
Yeah.
the game. It's the same thing in our national elections. Like most of us live in states where it almost doesn't matter,
Yeah.
right?
when you're voting for like president for like
Yeah.
the overarching,
Right.
because your state is going to
Yeah.
tend to go
But on a
in the
local
same
level,
direction.
like-
every vote literally.
And I think it's also, you can even translate of like, do you care about these initial initiatives, not in a local level, and a personal level too? Like we shoot so far into the national one and thinking that that's the ticket right there on how change can happen.
Well, because if you're rooting, that's the representative for your
Yeah.
team. So maybe it gives you this false sense of security that like our guys at the top.
yeah,
When you're forgetting
Yeah.
that the grassroots, that community, that communal movement
Yeah.
is so much more important. And that's kind of the beauty of the way I think the United States works and the way that we vote is different states do have different needs, right? Very different needs. We're not going to understand maybe like what someone needs in the middle of the country if we're on a specific coast or whatever it is. But also within a state, we forget that each district has very different needs, and you want to meet the needs of those people.
Yeah.
And there is a responsibility there. You should care about where you are because you can impact, and your needs are very unique.
that's another litmus test to see if you're rooting, is like, do you actually care about the initiative, not the person, you know,
Yeah.
the face, and
Yeah.
how much are you willing to zoom in on your own, you know, local area to care
and
about
local
those.
politics are just so much nicer than
And it doesn't take much. That's why I say it's potent. Like
Yeah.
I worked on a mayoral campaign when I was younger
Yeah.
and working in political science. Like I remember at the time, you know, the statistics were if we could get 900 votes, this person's on the city council and likely to be elected mayor, right? Like, and you think about it, like how many millions and millions of votes are cast in our state, and yet it doesn't make much of a difference. Like my one vote against them doesn't do much. But in my current city right now, it was something like if you get 1,700 votes, you'll get that person on the city council, right? So that is something that's like you could say, hey, we're going to all unite together. We're going to do something that may make a difference in our local area. I think we're obsessed with the national scene because it seems like it's the big stake.
Right.
It's the big
It's
prize.
visible.
Right. And we're rooting again, not voting, because
Rooting.
we're thinking like, where does the vote actually matter to the local initiative? So I think that's really important that we get it, because city councils, school boards, those things are really important to our actual lives and the lives of our neighbors. And we're so obsessed with just a big tug of war at the national level. And again, that's great. Vote there too. But don't forget that the place that it matters most is like a state senator, a state congressman, a state assembly person who's going to be making laws for the state that we live in, or even the county. Like a county board of supervisors will have a lot of influence over your life, right? And yet we're kind of ignorant actually to all
we're
of
not
those
stewarding
things.
those votes.
Yeah.
The
we're
ones
just
that are
kind of,
impacting the
we just
most.
root those as well. We're like,
Yeah.
hey, I'm going one way on everything because that's
Yeah.
what I'm supposed to do. And I think that if somebody were to investigate that, they'd realize like you're an uninformed voter. So maybe you wore the little sticker like I voted.
Yeah.
But you know, you really didn't, because you didn't really exercise a right where you thought I carefully considered things and then voted the way that I think the country should go. You just like, or even the city should go.
Yeah.
I just basically did. So that's the third one. The fourth one I wrote down was we could love our neighbor. We could even love our enemy and see better flourishing for the lives of all those around us through our vote. And that's something we rarely consider, is how the vote actually could influence the lives of others, right? So there could be easy examples, like you could say, well, we've had initiatives on our ballots about how we're going to deal with issues of homelessness in the area. And you think like, sure, there's ways that vote goes. There's votes where you're going to clear out whole communities. There's votes that maybe you're going to protect some of the communities. And we rarely think about the vote as anything other than what benefits us.
Yeah.
And I think that's bad stewardship if we're not really considering like, wait a minute, this is an instrument that I've been given to kind of consider like, how does this impact people who are different than me? Who are impoverished? How does this impact people who maybe don't have enough housing in our area, so they can't afford to rent here, so they have to move out of their areas? Like all sorts of things get impacted by the vote.
And even to me, to not skip over what you said, because it seems or it feels more profound to me in a sense, is you're like, love your neighbors and love your enemies through your vote. Like loving your enemies through your vote. What does that look like, and who do you consider your enemy? And would you want them to flourish, because then we're all flourishing together? Because I'm telling you, there's some people that vote in a way to stifle who they view their enemies, to stifle communities, to promote something very specific and narrow viewed. And that's something to consider, because, you know, if you're really thinking like, is this going to benefit my fellow humans, my fellow Americans, the fellow people in my communities, if it's going to do something good for them, like maybe I should support that.
Yeah, there are issues, and we see them all the time, where we know what we're supposed to do to follow our tribe on an issue, but you think, wait a minute, I need to slow down and think, is this some way that I can help reach people or benefit people that aren't like me or are different than me, or even who disagree with me on this issue?
Or dealing with it legislatively instead of by heart, like dealing with people's hearts. Yeah. Like actually sends maybe a message of anger and hate that's not a good steward of a vote. Like, oh, if we can't reach people's hearts, let's put it on the ballot to you know what I mean? Like there's just certain things to consider, and it's gray, it's sticky, it's a little messy. Like I understand, you know, why people vote certain ways, because, you know, maybe their morals or whatever are shaped by something specific, but to stop looking at it as like a weapon and more like, how can my vote be something that's healing, uniting, beneficial to everyone, loving to everyone, you know?
Yeah, we do use the vote as a sword, right?
Yes.
We do use it as a
cut
sword,
down.
right? Yeah. And I see a lot of this rhetoric around, like when you listen to people who are, you know, well-informed political science and Christian types kind of all put in together, and their view is like, hey, if the Christians could just get out there and vote, we would have so much more even influence over the society. And that might be true, but they usually mean it a certain way, which is, I want you to vote this way.
And is that actually going to drive people out of churches? Very possibly, yes. And is that actually hurting people? And, you know, like that's not thought about, because again, it's rooting.
It is.
But now it's rooting for Christian nationalism. I'm just going to say it for what it is. Oh, it came out. Then it's like rooting for Christian nationalism, right? Which is another thing to root for. And it gets even messier, because now we think it's like the godly thing to do. And what we're saying is maybe it isn't. Untangle those things, because maybe fighting for your faith by trying to legislate something and put someone down, maybe that isn't the best way to do it. And so when you change your perspective from stewarding my vote to love my enemies and my neighbor as myself
through a vote as well.
A vote versus like, I don't know what like winning, putting down, cutting down, stopping, squashing the thing, like using my vote to oppress, to stop, to, you know, to do those sorts of things. Very, very different perspective.
Do you see like in Gen Z, like there's a desire to vote? Is it really like something where people are like, I really want to exercise this? Is
absolutely.
Like a strong thing?
Oh, absolutely.
And does it go along with kind of some knowledge about what the issues are, or is it more like I want to get out there? Like how do you view that?
I don't want to, you know, say an entire generation is, you know, one way. So that people care, and I think what I will say about Gen Z and younger people is that they care about social justice, they care about politics, and they are eager for change. Eager and hungry and desire for change, and for change to be brought about. So yes, they care about voting. I will say though that we're not accomplished in local politics and learning about that, and we can be very ignorant about that, because we can fall into the trap of the big change from the top down,
the
level.
Big picture,
the
or
big
getting
picture.
Involved to stop something as opposed to considering like,
and I think perhaps sometimes the desire for change can negate the steps to get there and the local politics and whatnot and the changes that are tangible.
Or it's harder to care about what we view as like, I don't know, tell me if Gen Z feels this way, smaller things.
Yeah.
And which are like actually the big things. And we're like, no, we want to change on a big scale. So
take down the patriarchy, like bring it all down, you know.
Right. As opposed to like, hey, wait a minute though, these smaller things are actually very powerful.
And I'm curious how, I won't say make a statement for Gen Z on this, but I'm curious on how faithful we can be to the small change and to the steps to bring that about. Like I'm really curious, like are we so stuck in our virtue signaling and the big the rally and the big thing, like do we care about the outward picture of change and not the actual change? And
that's actually the part of the thing that I've observed too, is that like even when you mention like the rally, there's always like a cause that's really hot at the moment and everybody's rallying and supporting, especially in Gen Z. But as somebody who's watched these things come and go over a much longer period of time, you go, what is actually changing though?
Right.
Like the policies could change something if we got down in some of those things that you're calling smaller things, like those make a difference.
Right. Then you just end up getting frustrated and stifled and jaded.
Or the next cause comes along and you got to rally for something else, right? And then you forget the one that came before it.
Yeah.
So now everybody's moved on to something else.
Yeah, and no one's been faithful to the cause that they've had.
But that's because that stuff is hard. It takes legislation. It takes compromise in politics. Like we won't even have compromise anymore, right? Yeah. But on the local level, by the way, when you get down to the local level, everybody's compromising. Everybody's doing whatever they have to do to get laws passed, right?
Yeah. My husband went to like a mayoral campaign event for work. And when he came home, he was like, it was so nice. Like the person she's running against was there and they hugged each other and they were talking and shaking hands. And just like, he was like, I was very shocked by that because you have this view that everything is like the presidential debates and how ugly that gets in mudslinging. And I think if more of us cared about kind of the local thing, you would learn something about unifying and working together, and you would see something different that maybe would give you more hope and less jadedness.
That's where America still works, is at that level.
Yes.
Where you walk in and you're like, you know what? This is a place where you can actually say, hey, let's meet in the middle. Let's achieve something together. Let's work together, both sides of any issue, right? We can get something done.
And maybe if you start there and you actually get involved in that and care about that, maybe it starts to change your heart to the bigger things too. And if everyone just started caring about that part, it might grow into the way that you view the bigger.
I'm curious, like what Jesus would say, because when we look at his teachings, it's so much so with like the actions that you do and you are responsible for, and your participation in that, and not the rally and not the hoorah, you know. So
I'm going to add one here, and I think that's, if you're going to steward your vote, one of the ways to steward your vote wisely is stop electing extreme people, because that's exactly what's fracturing the country. And you know that you're rooting when you're tempted to vote for the most extreme person to stick it to the other side.
I was just going to say, you're like, there, just to like.
If you're excited by that, you're rooting and you're not voting. Like this country in my youth, you could not really tell the difference most of the time between Republicans and Democrats.
Yeah, very subtle.
When I was a student of political science in my undergraduate, like one of the critiques of the American system by people who are far more radical was that there is no difference between Democrats and Republicans. They're almost the same thing. They're just capitalists. They're almost the same thing. They're really not that different. Today, the country that 30 years later exists.
That's not even a lot of time. It's crazy.
I know, but we keep amplifying that, and it just adds more and more. So if you think, wait a minute, I want to see peacefulness in politics. I want to see stuff getting done. I actually want to see this in both at the national level, state level,
decorum.
Local. Yeah, I want to restore back like a feeling of unity.
It inspires the extremism. It falls into the individual as well. Like the extremism that's happening in politics is starting to seep into the individual. So it inspires you to be more extreme. And just by happenstance, a couple days ago, I was on a social media platform scrolling like my homepage, and there's someone I forgot I even followed, and they put up some political meme. I forgot exactly what it said, about someone that is on the other side of the aisle. And then in big caps at the top, all caps, his little ad to that was, if you needed a good reason to unfollow me, here it is, unfollow me now. And it's just, I was like, why are you almost like tempting people, like, this is who I am, and take a hike if you don't. And it becomes extreme, like that trickles down to, and then the individual becomes extreme.
Look, these politicians have figured out just how dark we are inside, how much we're afraid, how much we have a hatred. They're stoking these things in us.
And it becomes about what you're against.
Yeah. And look, in a two-party system for the most part, and it's two-party all the way down to like the local level in a lot of cases, you might not have a choice by the time you get to the voting booth for the final election. But this is what I'm going to say. This starts at the primary level. Yeah. This starts before. Let's say you're a Democrat. Let's say you're a Republican. You've got 5 or 6 people running in office for a certain position to be the Democratic nominee, to be the Republican nominee for state Senate, for anything. Yeah. If you're looking to make sure that the person who gets through that primary is the most extreme, you're playing into their game, because that's what they're doing.
100%.
They're signaling to you that, you know, they're the most extreme, just like you. They're whipping you up into a frenzy. And then we wonder why we can't get anything done, why government's broken, why we're so divided.
So then what do we do then if you're just left with the two extremists? That's just the way that politics is now. Well, how do we steward our vote then if that's the options?
Yeah, I think that this is going to be the controversial one probably. Is there are times when to steward your vote wisely, you have to refrain from voting. And if there's a check in your spirit immediately, you're like, I'm throwing away a vote. That's an American idea. And that's where we have to peel it apart, because there are, in our long tradition of Christianity, there are times when you say, I have to withdraw, I have to refrain. Like, if I cannot in good conscience vote for either of these people, then maybe I just won't on that one vote, right? Like, I can still vote locally. I can still vote on these initiatives. I could still vote if I'm educated about these other things. But
you should vote on those things locally. You should vote on these initiatives.
Because you still have a stewardship of your vote. It doesn't mean you just go,
because I'm hearing the voice saying, well, that's so irresponsible. You're not doing that. But it's like, actually, I'm going to put it into the more
it matters, because I think that, like, look, we're known by our vote. That's the other part we have to think about. There's a public witness component to our vote that gets twisted by both sides.
It should be anonymous.
It is. But what happens is the demographers come in, the sociologists come in, and they'll say things like 81% of white evangelicals voted for Trump. And then for the next, it's been 8 years since that happened. You keep hearing it over and over and over and over and over again, right? And they just can't get rid of that, right? So everybody knows zero about our faith from the outside, but they know the way you vote, right? Yeah. They know nothing about the love of Christ.
As a collective,
know nothing about, like, you're just in that. So you might raise your hand and say, wait, that doesn't include me, or I don't believe in that, or I don't subscribe to all those racist things that were said during the campaign. Like, it doesn't matter. Like, that's kind of how we view that group, right? And so I think there is a public component. And incidentally, you know, it's the same reason they whip up all the Christians to vote, is like, we need to show the world that we're taking back government for Christ and all these things. Like, I don't know that Christ would be 100% in favor of the way you guys are doing it, or even the aims that you're trying to get to, right? Yeah. Because this is a very,
the corruptedness of how those things,
so much corruption
marrying,
in this, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
and you're dragging the Lord's name into it.
Most of the time, what people don't recognize, because they think they're voting and they're with a party and they're rooting and all that stuff, they don't realize that they're being manipulated by huge moneyed interests behind it. There is so much money behind all of this, and all of these special interests and all of these large corporations and all these very wealthy individuals, they're actually using the population to get outcomes they want. And the population just thinks they're voting or they're doing these things. So I think we have a responsibility to say either, wait a minute, I'm not voting for the extremes because I'm just contributing to the problem. When the extremes are presented and neither one of them is viable, then maybe I have to actually say, you know what, for that office, I'm not voting. Like I'm just, and by the way, maybe only you and the Lord will know, because it is anonymous, right? And maybe the statistics will still come out and say, like all the Christians went this way.
If you truly can't come to a place in good conscience, like, I guess what we're saying is, let's take the weight off your shoulders. If you personally really can't come to a decision in good conscience, it's okay to say stewarding my vote is maybe, like you said, I don't vote for that one particular thing, one particular office, or one particular piece of legislation. if you don't feel at peace, I think that is a responsible way to steward your vote.
And if there's a check in your heart on that, because I just think that might be the American culture pulling more strongly than the way of Jesus. What's interesting to me is when I read other people that are in these like kind of Christian public policy think tanks, they would think that is bad stewardship to throw away a vote like that, because again, they're betting on the idea that they're going to convince all Christians to go a certain way, become a voting bloc, get certain laws passed. And I think, hold on, that's not even stewarding a vote. Like if you're just swept up in a mob mentality because certain religious leaders told you to go a certain way, and you're not stewarding anything at that point. You're just throwing in with the mob and you're not thinking through it. So I think that's the place where, actually, you know what? One thing that we should say is stewardship takes work. Like, what is stewardship? Jesus says, I'm giving you things for you to manage. You can't be lazy about it. It's going to require work. You have to produce something good out of it. I'm giving you these gifts. I'm giving you these talents. I'm giving you all this stuff for you to do something with it. It takes work. But I think we don't want to do that work. It's easier to just think, oh, my church told me that we're just going to go this way on all the issues. And that's what we're supposed to do, because that's what Christians do. Christians steward. Followers of Jesus steward. They think carefully and they weigh really deeply. They don't just go with mob mentality.
Like I don't know if there's a difference in these two things, and maybe it's very slight, but it's like one way to look at it is like, I'm a person who votes and I'm a Christian, and so I'm going to consider maybe how that shapes the way I do it. But then there are people who really think that part of their responsibility of Christianity is to vote, and to vote a specific thing. And they would say, like, if you're stewarding like God's morals like publicly, then the vote, it almost becomes like the 11th commandment. Like it becomes, do you know what I mean? Where it's like your Christianity requires this of you, the same way it would require you to give to the widow and provide for the poor, and like is this vote. So how do we separate that? Because when we talk about a witness and voting, like those, they are different, right? And can you speak to how they're different?
Well, first, it's a manipulation, I think, because it really puts this guilt on you that you've got to do something, and you only can do it one way in most of these cases. That is actually a lie, to look at our right to vote, the fact that we get to vote, as something that becomes this obligation that you must vote a certain way or else you're sinning. Some people have come out and said, like,
that's what I'm
if you
saying.
vote for anybody other than a Republican, like that's a sin.
It's a sin, and it's your responsibility as a Christian to get Christian legislation, whatever that means.
That is a lie. Actually, that's heresy, right? You're turning something, you're actually turning this vote into an idol, and you're imposing it, and you're moving it out through the churches in a way that I don't think that's what Jesus had in mind.
And all of a sudden you're a good Christian or a bad Christian, depending on how you engage with this.
Right. And the public witness part, maybe that's getting lost on people. It's not just the statistics and the demographers and all the sociologists that then study what Christians do. But let me pause there for a moment, because they do study what Christians do very carefully.
For a reason.
And they find the hypocrisy is so rich when we vote certain ways that don't align with what our Lord teaches.
Actually,
and they can never let it go, because they think they got something to beat us with over, and they do it all day long.
And then you're a bad public witness.
You are. Most of us are. Like, I would say that the ways that we express ourselves in public. But the other part of the public witness, I mean, this is just an example to show you what I read. So I'm reading an article in The Atlantic, very influential magazine. And the article is about the prayers at the Trump rallies. Not the Trump rallies themselves, but somebody actually took the time to study all the prayers that were prayed.
Prayers before, like in the microphone that they were...
before the rally, because they get up before, I'm
interested.
Before,
I know, I'm
so this, like, to me, I was like, oh, what a great idea for an article. So what are people, the pastors that they bring up to pray at the rallies, praying? And the observation in the article, I'll just sum it down to this, was back, let's say, 4, 5, 6 years ago, the argument was this is a flawed individual, but God is using them, kind of like a King Cyrus, like anybody knew who that was before they went digging him out of the Bible.
These are in the prayers?
No, this is what they used to pray. They would say, like, they wouldn't pray out loud like he's a flawed individual, Lord, but that's what the kind of theology around this election was. But now what they were saying is, if you listen to these prayers, they are prayers of messianic fervor for this candidate. The nation is lost without a person who is God's unique person to save the nation. Now, you think that's crazy, but I would tell you that so many people believe that.
I don't,
because
it's
if
not
you-
even, my
serious?
sigh is not
Yeah.
even that I think it's crazy. My sigh is it's a lamentation and it's sorrow and it's disappointment.
Right. But this is our public
Straight
witness.
up, like
So
the language of
if-
the
yep.
messianic.
Yep. I mean, like they were quoting from the prayers because they actually took time, like most people didn't even know this was going on. Like they pray before rallies, but they said they took all of over, like I think it was a 10-month period. They were like reading all the prayers and
Like they were
quoting from
divinely
them.
chosen
Yep,
candidate,
yep.
of the divine chosen by the,
And
that's
so
very,
this is what I mean by a public witness. Like, look, you're the writer of this article in the
the Lord
Atlantic.
will not let him be stopped.
Yep. All of those things. So, or you're just somebody who's not a believer at all who happens to be at this rally, or you're somebody who read this article from afar because you're not even a part of this party. And you read this and you think, this is what they think. So the unique hope for the future of our country is a single candidate who God has uniquely brought forward as a messianic figure. Like you start
Mercy.
thinking like, I think that is heresy. I think that is crazy. And yet it's
Yeah.
being prayed rally after rally. So
I
what
know
I'm-
that's heresy.
So-
that is heresy.
That's what I mean by we have to be careful of our public witness, because maybe those pastors think that's what they're called to do. I have no idea what they're doing. Maybe they actually believe this. Maybe they're told by the campaign, like, hey, this is what we want to say. I have no idea what's going on, but to the outside world,
Yeah.
that is what we believe. And there's no way they're going to hear us saying like, I don't believe that at all.
Yeah, that's
right?
that's
Like,
a
we're-
huge
on
platform.
either end.
Drowned
That's a
out by that.
on
broadcasting
either end.
platform.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be accepting this messianic view from any political party. Like
Yeah.
you are the savior of the American people.
Yeah. So maybe that's our final place to land. Is one of the ways to steward a vote is you have to consider who you are aligned with when you vote. It is a way to consider it. And I'm going to use the opposite example. Years ago, I mentored a young man who was going through seminary and was my resident. And he was a strong proponent of the Democratic Party and wanted to vote as liberally and progressively in every election as possible. And I remember as I was mentoring him, the question I asked him is, okay, but who are you aligned with when you do that? Like which other, like you're voting for certain candidates, that's great, but who's behind them? Who's actually paid for their campaign? What policies are they expected to toe the line on once they get there? Don't think of this as just a two-person race. Like the minute you vote and that candidate's elected, all of these other people come into
Come
office
along
with
with
them,
them.
right?
Yeah.
And that's something we never consider, like which special interests are behind them, which policies have already been written waiting for the day they take office. Like who are the people that they owe something to?
Yeah.
Because they wouldn't have gotten elected, they wouldn't have raised money, they wouldn't have, unless
All
they
the
made
important
promises.
questions.
Yep, they made promises to support certain positions. They made promises to elect certain people to certain offices. Like all of this has gone on. Like don't think that people are just naturally just giving away their money. That's the suckers that just do that. Everybody else is saying, I'll give you this much money, but you agree to support this thing.
Right.
Or you'll appoint these people to the court, or you'll appoint these people to your cabinet.
And part of stewarding a vote is investigating all of
You
that.
need to know whose hand you're holding. Like he was thinking like, I will never vote for anybody on the right. I'm solidly over here. I'm like, yes. Now whose hand are you holding?
Right.
Right. I mean, because we're all going to do that somehow. And we have to consider all of those things deeply.
And what's attached to each.
Yeah. So unfortunately for us in this issue, I think most Christians have been painted with a very broad brush. And what saddens me the most is it's really hard to shout above all of that and say, no, Jesus requires a different way.
Yeah.
But the good news is that each of us does have a vote and we can steward it for the Lord.
Yeah.
And we will do it before the Lord.
Yeah.
Nobody else has to know how we
Right.
voted, but the Lord knows.
We'll know.
And we can say, I did this. I thought about it. I investigated
Yeah.
it. I thought, who's behind this? I want to make a difference. I want to love my neighbor. I want to do all these things.
And this is what I truly think will
Right.
benefit. And the way that we do it too, because I'm so sick of the language like, oh, well, they're an idiot, or I don't like the way they talk, or, oh, it's like, we got to take that language out too. Like
Yeah.
that the other person's just a moron and that like all the negative. And it's like, no, let's just really listen to the messaging and look at the policy and read it kind of with those emotions taken out of it. And really studying like what's actually there as opposed to name calling and
even like
labeling
the way
others
that we
and
see ourselves, like holding it loosely after I make this vote, like this person will fail me that I vote for too.
Yeah.
And or maybe that's not the person I voted for, like as as a believer, as a Christian, are you willing to pray for the people that are elected, whether you voted for them or not? Just like open-handed, and then giving all authority back to the Lord. On like that it's his sovereign hand that is working
and actually hoping for the best instead of hoping for their downfall. Because
hoping for the best, not hoping for the win.
Yeah, it's really hard. Like, I want to always go back to, like, if Jesus was with us now, would he be standing at the border with a rifle trying to keep people out? Would he be trying to take people off of state aid that's keeping their family in a home? Would he be protesting outside of a clinic? Like, I'm trying to analyze those things honestly, because if Jesus wouldn't, I shouldn't. If he would, then I should, right? If I'm following Jesus and not my party, not my ideology, not my region, I'm actually trying to follow, like, what would he do in this case?
And with the heart that he had, like, let our hearts try to align with that.
Yeah. I remember when they were separating migrants from their children and putting children in all those like really crazy places, that we had an attorney general who stood up on TV and read scripture. Like, this is commanded by God. And like it's so bizarre, but like in that one moment, that public witness probably wiped away so many other people's attempts to ever consider anything the Bible said. I mean, not only, I think, was it a misquotation, misrepresentation, but that's the idea. And I think, no, that's your ideology. That's your view. I don't really think that's biblical, but who's going to listen to me, right? Like, that's the frustrating part of it, but the Lord knows.
And supporting those types of candidates too also means that you're supporting that type of misinformation about faith.
Here's our final word. Stewardship belongs to the Lord. Like, he's given us something to steward for his purposes. So if you steward it well, even if nobody else does, then you're doing the thing that Jesus commanded us to do. He gave us in Matthew 25 an example and a parable of how to steward everything he's given to us, and that we do it for him. One day he returns and we make accounting for everything that we've ever had and what we've done with it. And we say, look, Master, you gave me this. Here's what I do with it. So if you find some despair in what we're talking about, the good news is you have a vote, you can steward it for the Lord, and it is yours to give to the Lord in the way. So take it seriously, be educated. Think about how Jesus would exercise that vote, because he's the one that gave it to you to exercise on his behalf, and do something loving with the vote. And we might make some difference. In the end, he'll make all the difference, right? Whatever difference we make is just a small amount compared to the difference he's going to make. So that's one of the ways that we could steward our vote during this election season. Steward it unto the Lord. This is Jesus versus America.
Follow us on all social media platforms at Jesus versus America, and find more resources on our official website, jesusversusamerica.com.